When my wife walked through the door that night, I could tell something was different. Then she told it to me. My name is David, and for 12 years, I thought I was living the kind of life most people dreamed of. I was married to Lauren, my college sweetheart, and together we built what looked, from the outside, like a perfect life. I worked as an engineer, a steady, no-frills job that I enjoyed, and Lauren was a rising star in interior design. We owned a charming two-story house in a quiet neighborhood, complete with a manicured lawn and a porch swing. On weekends, we hosted barbecues for friends or visited her parents' lake house. Our life was structured, predictable, and, as I thought, happy. We weren't without challenges, of course. There were occasional arguments about work stress or how often I forgot to pick up groceries, but we always found a way to make up. Over the years, we created a routine that felt like a safety net. Dinner together every evening, Sunday brunches at the little cafe downtown, and movie nights where we'd inevitably fall asleep halfway through. It was the kind of life people envied, not flashy, but solid. Or so I thought. In hindsight, I should have noticed the small signs of change. Lauren, who used to laugh at my bad jokes, had grown quieter at dinner. Her phone, once a shared tool for browsing recipes and planning trips, became something she guarded. "It's for work," she'd say if I glanced at her messages too long. She started going out more often, to networking events and client dinners. I didn't question it. I trusted her completely. That trust shattered on a Tuesday evening in late spring, though at first, it didn't seem like the kind of night that would change everything. I came home from work as usual, finding Lauren already there. She had lit a candle on the dining table, and the faint scent of vanilla wafted through the air. At first, I thought she had a surprise planned, maybe news of a big contract she'd landed or an impromptu date night. We ate dinner quietly, and I noticed Lauren seemed preoccupied, her gaze distant. She pushed her food around on her plate, taking small bites but never finishing. "Are you feeling okay?" I asked, trying to mask my concern. She looked up, startled, as if I'd caught her mid-thought. "David," she said, her voice unnaturally soft. "We need to talk." The words instantly set me on edge. I couldn't pinpoint why they weren't new. Couples said them all the time in movies, TV shows, and even real life, but in that moment, they carried an unusual weight. I put down my fork and gave her my full attention, my heart already beginning to race. "What's on your mind?" I asked. She hesitated, her fingers playing nervously with the edge of her napkin. For a moment, I thought she was going to tell me something mundane, like she wanted to redo the kitchen backsplash or take a trip without me to visit an old friend. But then she took a deep breath and said the last thing I expected: "I think we should open our marriage." I froze, my mind blank. For a second, I wasn't even sure I'd heard her correctly. "I'm sorry," I said, forcing a small, awkward laugh. "What did you just say?" Lauren folded her hands in front of her, her expression carefully composed. "I think we should open our marriage," she repeated, her voice firm now. "I've been thinking about it a lot lately, and I think it could be good for us. You know, to explore, to grow. It's not about anything being wrong between us, David. It's about taking our relationship to the next level." Her words were so practiced, so polished, that for a moment, I felt like I was listening to a motivational speaker. "The next level?" I echoed, still trying to make sense of it. "Lauren, are you saying you want to see other people?" She nodded, her expression remaining calm despite the turmoil building inside me. "Yes. And you could, too," she added quickly, as if that would soften the blow. "We'd both have the freedom to explore, and we'd always come back to each other. It's progressive, you know? A lot of couples are doing it now. It's not like it would mean we love each other any less." I stared at her, trying to comprehend the words coming out of her mouth. They felt alien, completely disconnected from the woman I thought I knew. Is this about someone specific?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. "Is there someone you're already seeing?" She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough. "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "Of course not. This isn't about anyone else. It's about us. I just want to keep things exciting, you know? I want to make sure we don't get stuck in a rut." Her words hung in the air, and I could feel the weight of their implications pressing down on me. The life I thought I knew, the woman I thought I knew, suddenly felt like a house of cards, teetering on the edge of collapse. "Lauren," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady, "this doesn't sound like it's about us. It sounds like it's about you." Her face hardened, the calm mask slipping for just a moment. "Why are you reacting like this?" she asked. "I thought you'd at least consider it." I couldn't respond. The words were there, buried beneath the shock and the growing sense of betrayal, but I couldn't form them into sentences. That night, I moved into the guest room, unable to share a bed with a woman who suddenly felt like a stranger. As I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, a gnawing suspicion began to take hold. Something wasn't right. This wasn't just about growth or progressiveness. There was more to Lauren's proposal than she was letting on, and I knew I couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling in my gut. The guest room was quiet that night, too quiet. I lay awake, replaying Lauren's words over and over in my mind. Open our marriage? Freedom to explore? These weren't the kinds of things couples with 12 years of trust and commitment said to each other. I couldn't help but wonder, what had changed? Lauren and I had always been honest with each other, or at least I thought we had. But as I lay there staring at the ceiling, I realized that I didn't truly know what she'd been thinking for the past few months. My gut told me there was something she wasn't saying, something that went beyond her carefully rehearsed pitch about growth and freedom. The seed of doubt had been planted, and now it was growing fast. The next morning, Lauren acted like nothing had happened. She was cheerful, even affectionate, as she handed me my coffee and kissed my cheek before I left for work. "Have a great day, honey," she said with a smile that felt just a little too forced. I managed to nod, still trying to process the shift in our dynamic. It was like we were playing parts in a theater production, husband and wife, perfectly composed on the surface but teetering on the brink backstage. Over the next few days, Lauren brought up the idea again, carefully testing the waters. She framed it as a collaborative conversation, using phrases like mutual agreement and shared understanding. She painted a picture of freedom and excitement, a chance to reignite our relationship. But no matter how eloquently she framed it, I couldn't shake the sense that her words were hollow, masking a deeper truth. Finally, I asked her the question that had been haunting me since the night she first brought it up. "Lauren," I said, trying to keep my tone calm, "why now? Why suggest something like this after all these years?" She hesitated, her hand pausing mid-stir in her cup of tea. I don't want us to become stagnant," she said after a moment. "I've seen so many couples who stay together but stop really living, you know? I don't want that for us." It sounded reasonable on the surface, but there was something in her tone, something hesitant and uncertain, that set off alarm bells in my mind. "And this has nothing to do with anyone else?" I pressed, studying her face for any sign of deception. "No," she said quickly, too quickly. "This is just about us. I promise." Her words didn't convince me, but I let it drop for the moment. I needed time to think, to piece together the puzzle that was slowly forming in my mind. I started paying closer attention to the small things, the way she suddenly seemed more guarded with her phone, the way she dressed up more often, the subtle changes in her routine. They were tiny shifts, almost imperceptible, but once I noticed them, I couldn't unsee them. Then came the day that changed everything. I decided to work from home, telling Lauren I needed a quiet day to focus on a major project. She didn't question it, why would she? But the truth was, I wanted to observe her, to see if there was anything unusual about her behavior when she thought I wasn't paying attention. Around midday, she walked into the kitchen, her phone pressed to her ear. "I've got a client meeting this afternoon," she said casually as she poured herself a glass of water. "It might run a little late, so don't wait up for dinner." "Okay," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Good luck with the meeting." She left the house about an hour later, dressed more elegantly than usual. Her hair was styled, her makeup was flawless, and she wore a perfume I hadn't smelled in months. It was a detail that might have gone unnoticed on any other day, but now, it felt like a glaring red flag. As soon as she drove away, I noticed she had left her tablet on the counter. I hadn't planned to snoop, it wasn't something I'd ever done before, but a message notification caught my eye. I hesitated, my conscience warring with my curiosity. In the end, curiosity won. I unlocked the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. The message was from Chris, one of her colleagues. "Can't wait to see you later. You looked stunning today." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, rereading the message to make sure I wasn't imagining it. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. I grabbed my car keys and decided to follow her. I told myself I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. As I started the engine and pulled out of the driveway, one thought repeated in my mind like a mantra: she wouldn't lie to me, would she? But deep down, I already knew the answer. I followed Lauren's car with a mixture of dread and determination, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my hands began to ache. She drove with purpose, weaving through the familiar streets of our town before heading toward the outskirts. As the surroundings grew less familiar, my unease deepened. When she finally pulled into the parking lot of a modest hotel, my heart dropped. A hotel. Of all places. I parked several spaces away, my chest tightening as I watched her step out of the car. She looked beautiful, her hair neatly styled and her makeup subtle but perfect. Her outfit, a tailored blazer and pencil skirt, seemed professional, but now I questioned everything. Was this a work meeting, or was it something far more personal? Then another car pulled into the lot, and the situation became clearer. Chris stepped out. Chris, her colleague. The same Chris whose name had appeared on her tablet in that message that had sent my suspicions spiraling. He smiled as he walked toward Lauren, greeting her warmly. They exchanged a brief hug, not overly intimate, but enough to make my stomach churn. I fumbled with my phone, snapping a photo through the windshield. My hands shook as I captured what I thought was undeniable proof. They disappeared into the hotel, leaving me alone in the car with my thoughts. Anger, betrayal, and confusion swirled in my head. Why would she lie about a client meeting? Why here? I wanted to march inside and demand answers, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear of what I might discover, fear that confronting her now would only make things worse. Instead, I waited, my mind replaying every moment of our marriage, searching for clues I might have missed. After what felt like an eternity, they emerged. Chris held a small stack of papers in his hands, and they were deep in conversation, their expressions serious. Lauren gestured toward something in the distance, and Chris nodded, jotting something down. They didn't touch again, not even a handshake as they parted ways. Lauren got into her car and drove off, her face thoughtful but composed. I followed her home, my mind racing. Was this really what it looked like? Or was there a rational explanation? By the time I stepped through the door behind her, my anger had simmered into cold suspicion. How was your meeting? I asked casually, leaning against the kitchen counter. Lauren paused for just a second, then smiled. Good. Very productive. Productive for you and Chris? I asked, keeping my voice neutral but firm. She froze, her eyes narrowing slightly. What are you talking about? I pulled out my phone and slid it across the counter, showing her the photo I had taken. Her face paled as she stared at it, her jaw tightening. For a moment, I thought she might deny everything, and my heart sank. But instead, she exhaled sharply, her shoulders sagging as she looked at me. David, she said, her voice steady but tinged with frustration, I know how this looks, but I promise you, it's not what you think. Then explain, I said, crossing my arms. Why are you meeting him at a hotel, and why didn't you tell me? She sighed, rubbing her temples as if trying to summon patience. I didn't tell you because I knew you'd react like this. Chris and I are working on a design proposal for a high-profile client. The client prefers discretion, they don't want their home discussed in public places, so we needed somewhere quiet to meet. The hotel conference room was the best option. And the text message? Can't wait to see you later? I shot back. That was about the project, David, she said, her tone exasperated. He's excited about landing the client. It's a huge deal for both of us. Her explanation sounded reasonable, but the tension in my chest refused to ease. You expect me to believe this? After everything I saw? Lauren didn't flinch. Yes, I do. Because it's the truth. If you don't believe me, call the hotel. Ask if we booked a conference room. Or call the client, we've been in touch with them all week. I'm not hiding anything from you, David. Her calmness unnerved me, but it also forced me to reconsider. If she was lying, she was doing an incredible job of staying composed. Why didn't you just tell me about this earlier? I asked, my voice softening slightly. Because I knew you'd overthink it, she said, her tone gentler now. You've been distant lately, and I didn't want to add to your stress. I thought it would be easier to handle this without making it a big deal. Clearly, I was wrong. I studied her face, searching for any hint of deception, but all I saw was weariness and hurt. Finally, I pulled out my phone and searched for the hotel's number. A quick call confirmed her story. The hotel had indeed rented out a small conference room under Chris's name for a business meeting. The tension drained from my body, replaced by a mix of relief and guilt. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions." Lauren's expression softened, though there was still a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "David, I understand why you're upset. But you have to trust me. If we don't have that, what do we have?" I nodded, feeling the weight of my doubts and mistakes. "You're right," I said. "I'll work on it." That night, I moved back into our bedroom, determined to rebuild the trust one had so nearly destroyed. But even as I lay beside her, I couldn't help but wonder, what had changed between us to make me doubt her so deeply in the first place? Dinner was quiet. Too quiet. The clinking of utensils on our plates felt magnified, each sound ricocheting off the walls like a reminder of the unresolved tension between us. Lauren looked serene, focused on her food, but I knew her well enough to sense the tightness in her movements, the way she avoided meeting my gaze for more than a second at a time. I wasn't hungry, though I pushed food around my plate to keep up the appearance of normalcy. My mind was racing, consumed by the image of her and Chris outside that hotel. I thought I'd feel better after confirming her story, after hearing the hotel staff confirm the room booking, after double-checking the details of the project she'd mentioned. But I didn't. The truth might have been clear on the surface, but beneath it was a tangle of emotions I couldn't unravel. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I set my fork down and stared at her. She must have sensed the shift because she looked up, her brow furrowing slightly. "David," she asked. I exhaled, trying to steady myself. "We need to talk," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. She tilted her head, her expression wary. "Okay. What about?" I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "About yesterday. About everything." She sighed softly, placing her napkin on the table. "David, I've told you everything. What more do you want me to say?" "It's not about what you said," I replied, my voice tightening. "It's about how it felt. Watching you walk into that hotel, seeing you with Chris, it wasn't just the meeting, Lauren. It was everything leading up to it. The distance, the secrecy. It felt like I didn't even know you anymore." Her expression shifted, frustration flashing in her eyes. "Secrecy," she said, her voice rising slightly. "David, I wasn't hiding anything. I didn't tell you because it didn't seem like a big deal. It was just work." "Work doesn't usually involve someone calling you stunning," I shot back. Her jaw clenched, and I could see her struggling to keep her composure. "Chris flirts with everyone," she said. "It's how he is. But that doesn't mean anything happened. And the fact that you're clinging to that text like it's proof of something," she shook her head, her voice trailing off. "It's not just the text," I said, my voice quieter now but no less intense. "It's the way you've been lately. Distant. Guarded. Like you've been living in another world, and I'm just an afterthought." Her face softened, and for the first time that evening, I saw a flicker of vulnerability. She looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. "I didn't realize you felt that way," she said quietly. "Because you didn't ask," I replied. She looked up then, her eyes glassy but steady. "You're right," she admitted. "I didn't ask. And I've been distant. But it wasn't because of anything or anyone you think." "Then why?" I asked, my voice more pleading than accusatory. She hesitated, as if weighing how much to say. Finally, she exhaled and leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "Because I've been scared," she said softly. "Scared that we're losing each other. Scared that we're becoming one of those couples who just drift apart. And I didn't know how to talk about it, so I buried myself in work. I thought if I kept busy, it would get better on its own." Her words hung in the air, raw and unguarded. I wanted to say something, but I didn't know where to start. She continued, her voice trembling. "That's why I brought up the idea of an open marriage. It wasn't because I wanted anyone else. It was because I thought you might. I thought maybe I wasn't enough for you anymore. Her confession hit me like a punch to the gut. All this time, I had been building her up as the villain, the one pulling away, the one keeping secrets. And yet here she was, exposing her own fears, her own insecurities. "Lauren," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper, "you've always been enough. More than enough. But I didn't see how much you were struggling. I should have. I should have been there for you." She shook her head, a tear slipping down her cheek. "This isn't just on you, David. I should have talked to you. I should have told you how I was feeling instead of letting it fester. I didn't, and I'm sorry." Her apology was so genuine, so raw, that I felt the last of my anger dissolve. Reaching across the table, I took her hand in mine. "We've both made mistakes," I said. "But I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose us." She squeezed my hand tightly, her eyes searching mine. "Then we fix it," she said. "We figure this out together. No more secrets. No more distance. Just us." That night, as we lay in bed, I held her close, her warmth grounding me in a way I hadn't felt in months. For the first time, I allowed myself to hope that we could find our way back to each other. But even as I drifted off to sleep, I couldn't ignore the small voice in the back of my mind. Trust had been cracked, not shattered, but could it ever truly be whole again? The morning after our confrontation, I woke up feeling the kind of cautious optimism I hadn't experienced in weeks. Lauren was still asleep, her breathing soft and steady beside me. For a moment, I let myself believe that maybe things could return to the way they were. Maybe the worst was behind us. I got up quietly, made coffee, and stared out the kitchen window at the backyard. The world outside seemed unchanged, calm, predictable, steady. But inside, everything felt fragile, as if the slightest misstep could shatter the tentative peace Lauren and I had rebuilt. She joined me a little later, her steps tentative. There was a quietness to her that morning, a softness in the way she moved around me, as though she was afraid of breaking the fragile truce we had reached the night before. She smiled faintly when our eyes met, but the weight of everything unsaid lingered in the room. Over breakfast, we didn't talk about Chris or the hotel or the tension that had been tearing at us. Instead, we discussed mundane things, her upcoming deadlines, my latest project at work, the leaky faucet in the bathroom. It felt normal, almost comforting, but there was an undercurrent of awareness in every exchange, a shared understanding that normalcy wasn't something we could take for granted anymore. When I left for work, Lauren kissed me goodbye, her lips lingering against mine just long enough to make me pause. "Have a good day," she said, her voice warm but tinged with something else, hope, perhaps, or maybe resolve. As I drove to the office, I replayed our conversation from the night before, turning over every word, every moment of vulnerability. Lauren had opened up in a way she hadn't in years, and for the first time, I saw how much fear she had been carrying, how much doubt. But while her confession had given me clarity, it had also left me with questions I didn't know how to answer. At work, I tried to focus, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Lauren. I wondered if she was thinking about me, too, or if she had already thrown herself into her projects as a way of coping. I thought about calling her, but something held me back. It felt too soon, like we both needed time to process everything before we could move forward. That evening, when I came home, she was waiting for me in the living room, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked tired but peaceful, her legs curled beneath her on the couch. "Hey," she said softly when I walked in. "Hey," I replied, setting my bag down and sitting beside her. We didn't speak for a while, letting the silence settle between us like a familiar blanket. It wasn't uncomfortable, though, more like the quiet of two people who were finally beginning to understand each other again. Eventually, Lauren set her glass down and turned to me. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice steady but tinged with hesitation. "About everything. About us." I braced myself, unsure of what was coming next. "I want to be better," she said. "For us. I don't want to keep things bottled up anymore, and I don't want to push you away. But I need you to meet me halfway, David. I need you to trust me." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything we had been through. I nodded slowly, knowing that trust wasn't something I could promise outright. It was something that would have to grow again, piece by piece, through every conversation, every decision, every moment we shared. "I want to trust you," I said honestly. "And I'll work on it. But I need time. She reached for my hand, her grip firm but gentle. "That's all I'm asking for." In the days that followed, we began to rebuild, cautiously and deliberately. Lauren made an effort to include me in her work life, sharing updates about her projects and even inviting me to meet her clients. I, in turn, tried to let go of my need for control, resisting the urge to double-check every detail or look for hidden meanings in her words. There were moments of doubt, of course, small flickers of insecurity that surfaced when I saw her texting or working late. But each time, I reminded myself of the sincerity in her voice, the vulnerability she had shown me. And slowly, those flickers began to fade. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Lauren leaned her head against my shoulder. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" I asked. "For giving us a chance," she replied. I didn't respond right away, letting her words settle. In that moment, I realized that trust wasn't just about believing in someone else. It was about choosing to believe, even when it felt risky. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we might actually have a chance to find our way back to each other. It was a Thursday evening, one of those unremarkable nights where everything felt steady, almost too steady. Lauren had been quiet all through dinner, her movements slow, her smile forced. At first, I didn't think much of it. We'd been navigating these uneasy waters for weeks, and silence had become part of the routine. After dinner, she lingered in the kitchen, washing dishes she'd usually leave for me. Something about the way she scrubbed, her knuckles white from gripping the sponge, struck me as odd. When she finally came into the living room, she stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at me as if gathering her courage. "David," she said softly. The tone of her voice made me look up immediately. It wasn't her usual sharpness or even the guarded warmth she'd adopted lately. It was something else, something raw. "Can we talk?" I set down the remote, feeling the air shift around us. "Sure," I said, sitting up straighter. She walked in, sitting across from me instead of beside me. Her posture was stiff, her hands wringing in her lap. I waited, sensing that whatever she was about to say wasn't going to be easy for her or for me. "I need to tell you something," she began, her voice trembling. "Something I should have told you sooner." I braced myself. The last time she'd said those words, it had been about Chris and that hotel meeting. But this time, the look in her eyes was different. It wasn't frustration or defensiveness. It was fear. "There's someone else," she said, her words barely audible. For a moment, I didn't react. My mind struggled to process what she'd just said. "Someone else?" I repeated, my voice flat, almost mechanical. She nodded, her gaze fixed on her hands. "It's not Chris," she continued quickly. "It never was. But there's someone. His name is Adam. He's someone I met a few months ago, through a client." My stomach twisted. Adam. The name meant nothing to me, yet it suddenly felt like it held the power to upend everything. "We've been seeing each other," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Not often. Only a few times. But it happened, and I couldn't keep lying to you." The room felt impossibly still. I stared at her, trying to find any trace of deceit or manipulation, but all I saw was a woman unraveling in front of me. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice calm but heavy. "Because I can't live with it anymore," she said, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I made a mistake, David. A terrible, selfish mistake. But I love you. I've always loved you. And I can't keep this from you if there's any hope for us." I leaned back, the weight of her confession pressing down on me. Strangely, I didn't feel the explosion of anger or betrayal I expected. Instead, I felt numb, as if her words had drained all the emotion out of me. "How am I supposed to believe you?" I asked after a long silence. "After everything, how do I know this isn't just another way to shift the blame?" She flinched at my words, her tears falling faster. "You don't," she said. "I know I've given you every reason not to trust me. But this isn't about blaming anyone. It's about being honest. About trying to fix what I broke." Her honesty, if that's what it was, didn't bring me the clarity I thought it might. Instead, it left me adrift, unsure of how to react or what to feel. Part of me wanted to scream, to accuse her of lying yet again, but another part of me wondered if this was the first real truth she'd given me in months. I got up and walked to the window, staring out at the darkened street. My reflection in the glass looked hollow, as if the man staring back at me was a stranger. Behind me, Lauren sobbed quietly, her anguish filling the room. I didn't turn around. I didn't say a word. My mind was racing, replaying the moments between us, searching for signs I might have missed. Eventually, her sobs quieted. When I turned back, she was sitting with her head in her hands, her shoulders slumped. I want to believe you, I said finally. But I don't know if I can. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. I'll do anything, she whispered. Anything to make this right. I didn't respond. Instead, I walked past her, heading upstairs to the guest room where I'd spent so many nights recently. I closed the door, leaving her alone in the silence of her confession. That night, as I lay staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about Adam. A man I didn't know, a man I'd never even suspected, had stepped into my life and taken something that wasn't his to take. But the most painful part wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the quiet, nagging question I couldn't answer: had Lauren truly confessed everything, or was there still more she wasn't saying? For now, I couldn't tell. All I knew was that the fragile hope I'd held on to just days ago was gone, replaced by the cold certainty that my marriage might never recover. The days after Lauren's confession passed in a blur. Our home became a place of awkward silences and forced politeness, where every word carried the weight of unspoken emotions. She tried to bridge the gap, offering small gestures, a coffee waiting for me in the morning, a hand on my shoulder as she passed, but none of it reached me. I felt hollow, as if her admission had carved out something vital inside me. Adam. His name had lodged itself in my mind like a splinter. I couldn't stop imagining him, what he looked like, what he had that I didn't, what he and Lauren had shared. Her admission had been vague, a few times, she'd said. But the details didn't matter. It wasn't about how many times or how far it had gone. It was about the simple, shattering fact that it had happened at all. Lauren said she loved me, that she was willing to do whatever it took to fix things. But love wasn't enough anymore. Every time I looked at her, I felt the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me, suffocating the part of me that still wanted to fight for what we had. One night, I sat in the guest room with my phone in my hand, staring at the empty search bar. Part of me wanted to type his name, to dig up every detail I could about this man who had stepped into my life without permission. But what would that accomplish? Knowing more wouldn't erase what had happened. Instead, I found myself scrolling through old photos of Lauren and me, vacations, anniversaries, lazy Sundays on the couch. I studied her smile in each picture, wondering when it had started to fade, when I had stopped noticing the cracks in the foundation of our marriage. The following weekend, Lauren asked if we could talk. Her voice was hesitant, her posture nervous, as if she were bracing for a storm. I want us to go to therapy, she said. I know it's a lot to ask, but I think we need someone to help us find a way through this. Her words hung in the air, heavy with both hope and desperation. I looked at her, at the woman I had once trusted with everything, and felt the weight of my own exhaustion. I don't know if I can, I said finally. Not after this. Her face crumpled, but she didn't cry. She nodded slowly, as if she'd been preparing herself for this answer. I understand, she said softly. That night, I packed a bag. There was no fight, no dramatic confrontation. Lauren watched silently as I moved through the house, her eyes red but her voice steady when she asked, "Where will you go?" "I'm not sure yet," I replied, avoiding her gaze. She didn't press me. She didn't beg. And somehow, that made it even harder. As I drove away, the house shrinking in the rearview mirror, I felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, anger, and something else I couldn't quite name. For so long, I had been clinging to the hope that we could fix what was broken, that the pieces of our life together could somehow fit back into place. But now, with the distance growing between us, I realized that some things couldn't be mended. Trust was like glass. Once shattered, it could be pieced back together, but the cracks would always remain, visible reminders of what had been broken. And for me, those cracks had become too wide to ignore. In the weeks that followed, I started over in small ways. I rented a modest apartment on the other side of town, focused on work, and reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years. Lauren reached out occasionally, text messages that went unanswered, voicemails I couldn't bring myself to listen to. I needed space, not just from her, but from the version of myself I had been in our marriage. The love I once felt for her hadn't disappeared. It lingered, like the faint scent of her perfume on the clothes I'd packed. But love without trust wasn't enough to build a life on, and I wasn't willing to sacrifice my own peace for the illusion of something whole. And so, life moved forward. Slowly, awkwardly, but steadily. Lauren and I became another story, two people who had loved, lost, and learned that even the deepest bonds could break. What's worse, finding out your partner lied about who they cheated with or realizing they're still keeping secrets? Write in comments your minds.